Welcome to the third and final part of our presentation on the Star of Bethlehem. If you have not yet seen the previous two parts, you should watch them first. You will find the links in the description below this video. Now, having spent a very long time on the historical and chronological details about the birth of Jesus and the origin of the wise men from the East, we come to the central question. Very much has been published on this subject. The internet is packed with websites about the question of what the Star of Bethlehem might have been. There are also many videos on YouTube, all trying to offer very different answers or solutions. Now, we will also try to get closer to a solution of this riddle, but without providing a definitive answer. This is because, if we approach the subject with honesty and impartiality, we will soon conclude that each of the theories presented so far has its strengths and weaknesses, and that there is therefore still no final clarification of the facts. Regardless, we are going to try anyway. If the Star of Bethlehem was no miracle, no angel, and no godly sign, what astronomical event or celestial phenomenon could be considered for it? As already mentioned, the problem is that the appearance of the star cannot be proven by historical evidence, since other contemporary chroniclers do not mention this phenomenon described by Matthew in a single word. There is no record of it, no inscription, and no fresco made by any contemporary witness. No other writer or chronicler reports the appearance of this mysterious star. But if the Gospel writer's account is true, the apparition must have been visible over a period of several months, since the Magoi observed it both when they left Mesopotamia and still when they arrived in Bethlehem. And the journey of the wise men must have lasted at least 2 or perhaps 3 months. This narrows the choice of astronomical phenomena to only 3. We will now examine these 3 main candidates for the Star of Bethlehem. The first theory assumes that at the time of Jesus' birth, a so-called supernova lighted up, which could indeed be visible in the sky for several weeks to months. The second thesis is that there could have been a bright comet in the sky. These celestial bodies are also sometimes visible for weeks. A third consideration is based on a rare and astrologically significant planetary alignment, a so-called conjunction. Let's start with the theory that the Magoi may have seen the flashing of a new star, a supernova. The term nova or supernova is misleading, as this extremely rare celestial spectacle is by no means the formation of a new star, as was previously assumed, but the contrary is the case. It is the explosion, and thus, so to speak, the death of a distant sun, in our galaxy or even in other galaxies far away. But, of course, no one knew that in the past. Nor did the Danish astronomer, Tycho Brahe, who in 1572 observed such a supposedly new star in the constellation of Cassiopeia, by calling it the greatest of all wonders. It was he who named this phenomenon Nova Stella, new star. This new star was shining as brightly as Venus and remained visible in the sky for months. The German mathematician and astronomer, Johannes Kepler, likewise sighted a new star 32 years later, but this time in the constellation of Ophiuchus, the serpent-bearer. And this is astonishing because these are extremely rare events. The fact that 2 supernovae of such a brightness light up within some decades was already an unbelievable coincidence. This is shown by the fact that since Kepler's new star of 1604, until today, more than 400 years, no further observation of a supernova in our Milky Way has been made. A Chinese report tells of an even older event of this kind. According to this report, a new star appeared in the constellation of Taurus on July 4, 1054. In the Western world nobody had noticed this bright star, at least there are no reliable observations recorded in Europe for this period. But the Chinese, who have been observing the sky for thousands of years, for the same reasons as once the Babylonians did. Records from the Song dynasty, written in the 14th century, testify to this. Chinese astrologers refer to it as a guest star, and report that the supernova was visible during the day, like Venus. The sophisticated technology of today's telescopes allows astronomers to detect the remnants of such stellar explosions in the depths of the Milky Way galaxy. Actually, there are visible remnants of both Tycho's and Kepler's supernova. Those are giant clouds of gas and dust in the depths of our galaxy. From these expanding nebulae, astronomers can draw some conclusions about the timing of the stellar explosions. Even the Chinese guest star of 1054 left a remnant, an impressive structure of gas and stellar debris, known today as the Crab Nebula. But of all supernova remnants discovered so far, none dates to the time around the birth of Jesus Christ. Only one even older Chinese report is worth mentioning, which tells of a star that is said to have appeared in the year 5 BC in the constellation Eagle, or Aquila, near the bright star, Altair. This new star is reported to have been visible for more than 70 days. In fact, astronomers found an object near the place in question that could have been the origin of this event. A so-called recurrent nova. Even though this type of object is called nova by astronomers, it is not an exploding star like a supernova. Therefore, it also leaves no visible remains. Instead, this star repeatedly lights up in very long periods. The star temporarily brightens greatly, which we see as a nova. After a few days, the star begins to fade, and after several months it is back to its original brightness, which may be quite faint. However, during its last outburst, this nova remained far below the visibility threshold for the naked eye, so it is doubtful whether the Chinese nova of 5 BC ever became bright enough to be considered the Star of Bethlehem. Kepler's idea of a nova or supernova as a solution for the mystery of the Star of Bethlehem can be almost excluded. Most probably, the Christmas star was no star in the astronomical sense. But maybe a comet? Origen had already expressed this assumption for the first time in the 3rd century and in many representations, which appear each year during Christmas season. The star shows a comet's tail. And certainly, it makes sense at first sight that a comet with its tail like an arrow could be suitable to literally show the Magi the right way. Whoever saw the comet Hale-Bopp in 1997, which was brightly visible to the naked eye for weeks, will relate to this. Comets are rare guests in the night sky. They are small celestial bodies, usually a few kilometers in diameter, that pass through our solar system and occasionally develop a luminous tail near the sun. Only then they may become an impressive phenomenon. These celestial bodies are probably remnants from the formation of the solar system, consisting of ice, dust, and loose rock. This was also confirmed by the research results of the Rosetta space probe and its lander Philae, which explored the nucleus of comet Churyumov-Gerasimenko at close range a few years ago. Most researchers today, however, are convinced that the Star of Bethlehem could only have been a celestial phenomenon that could be predicted or precalculated at that time. This was not the case for comets for a long time. They appeared completely unpredictable to the people of ancient times and even the Middle Ages. For this reason, by the way, the supernova theory is also ruled out, because they also cannot be predicted. It was not until 1705, when the English astronomer Edmund Halley found out that some earlier comet appearances had similar orbits. Halley suspected that it had to be the same celestial body, recurring about every 76 years. Halley predicted the return of this comet in 1759 and was right. Even if he was not allowed to see the comet again himself, because he had already died 17 years earlier. Since then, this celestial body has been known as Halley's Comet. Subsequently, historical records of the appearance of this comet could be traced back to at least 240 BC. At that time, it was observed by Chinese astronomers who had been familiar with the phenomenon of comets for centuries. Even if their depictions of comets look more like the trophy collection in a hunting lodge. 76 years later, in 164 BC, Halley's Comet had been spotted by the Babylonians, who have chronicled its appearance on this cuneiform tablet. According to the Babylonian text source, the comet passed close to the planet Jupiter at that time. On its return in 12 BC, Halley's Comet terrified the Romans. Thus, it was held responsible for the death of General Agrippa. Perhaps the most famous depiction of Halley's Comet is found on the famous Bayeux Tapestry, which tells the story of the Norman conquest of England in 1066. After King Harold took the throne of England, William the Conqueror, who claimed the throne himself, crossed the English Channel with his army to defy Harold. At one part in the tapestry, several men point to a comet in the presence of the Anglo-Saxon king. Above it is written, Isti, Miranter, Stella. These wonder at the star. It was Halley's Comet, which must have been particularly bright and conspicuous in the sky in 1066. In the Cappella degli Scrovini in Padua, a small chapel painted with marvelous frescoes by Giotto da Bondone in 1304, we have the first and probably most famous representation of a comet as the Star of Bethlehem. And perhaps no one other than Halley's Comet was the model for it. Giotto had probably witnessed its appearance 3 years earlier and used it as inspiration for his fresco. But could Halley's Comet have been the Star of Bethlehem? Unlikely, because the nearest return to the birth of Jesus took place several years earlier. Halley's Comet was visible from October 12 to February 11 BC and is therefore ruled out. But could it have been another comet? After all, there are many of them. And even in the year of Julius Caesar's death, in June of 44 BC, a bright comet had appeared in the sky. Sidus Iulium, the star of the deified Julius Caesar. It was even engraved on coins. Ovid saw in it the soul of Caesar rising to heaven. However, later writers, including Shakespeare, placed the appearance of this comet before the Ides of March, making it an omen of the murder of Caesar. At least since then, comets have a bad reputation. According to ancient belief, the suddenly appearing tail stars showed up only on unlucky days. This was also due to the interpretation given by the Greek philosopher Aristotle in the 4th century BC for the appearance of comets. He thought that comets consist of bad and poisonous gases, which escape from the earth, climb up and ignite in great height. Since then, until the Middle Ages, and long after, comets were associated with disaster, according to popular belief. This comet phobia was fueled by broadsheets like this one. Illustrated pamphlets blaming comets for war, earthquakes, droughts, and starvation. Even the reformer Martin Luther, a declared opponent of astrology, remarked. The pagans wrote that comets come from natural causes, but God does not create one which will not indicate certain evil. Thus, comets were considered as heralds of misfortune. Even the sighting of Halley's Comet in 66 AD was subsequently seen as an omen for the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Therefore, it appears completely contradictory if a comet should have announced the birth of the Savior. If the birth of Jesus had been marked by a spectacular event such as a comet, which was considered an omen of great importance, Herod at least would have understood the wise men's reference to a star, and the shepherds would have been expecting something extraordinary to happen, instead of being surprised. Of course, bad things rarely happen just because comets were in the sky. However, the Anglo-Saxon king would certainly think differently about that because Halley's comet in 1066 really didn't bring him luck. At Hastings, the Norman army defeated the Anglo-Saxons. King Harold lost his life on the battlefield, and many people saw themselves confirmed in their opinion that comets are bringers of disaster. This leads us to the final and perhaps most exciting and promising theory about the Star of Bethlehem. As early as 5,000 years ago, people observed that some of the brightest stars in the sky changed their position over the course of days, weeks, and months. These 5 wandering stars were called planets. Sometimes there were also close encounters of these planets in the sky, which is called a conjunction. Of course, the planets do not really meet or even touch, but they only seem to. The planets are always hundreds of millions of kilometers away from each other. A conjunction can be an impressive celestial spectacle, but it can also be seen simply as an astrologically significant alignment of planets. And astrological interpretations, as we have learned, have always been of great interest. The Christian scholars of the Middle Ages already saw conjunctions as heralds of important events. But the most important thing is, unlike exploding stars and comets, ancient priest astronomers were quite capable of predicting these planetary conjunctions even with amazing accuracy. The theory according to which the Star of Bethlehem was a planetary conjunction, or at least related to one, is again closely associated with the name of Johannes Kepler, the great German mathematician and astronomer of the 17th century, who is best known for his laws of planetary motion. He observed a close encounter of the planets Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars in the evening sky over the city of Prague in the fall of 1604. In the same autumn, on October 9, 1604, Kepler discovered his new star, the supernova we have already heard about. The flashing of the new star happened at the same time and by chance even very close to the encounter of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. Kepler now assumed that the new star was related to the meeting of these planets. The astronomer thought that the new star was triggered or caused by the planetary conjunction. This is nonsense, of course, as we know today, because supernovae are much more distant than the planets and so these have absolutely no connection to each other. But the universe was much smaller in the learned minds of the 17th century, and Kepler thought that this connection might be quite plausible. Jewish astrologers predicted as early as the 12th century a meeting of the planets Jupiter and Saturn in the zodiac sign of Pisces in 1463, as a sign of the imminent birth of the Messiah. We have already mentioned that Jewish astrologers, who officially did not exist, would offer an interesting approach to the Star of Bethlehem. Kepler, who also practiced astrology, was familiar with this report. He calculated the positions of the planets and found a similar sequence of events around the time of Christ's birth. In the year 7 BC, a so-called triple conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter had taken place in the constellation of Pisces. So why, he thought, shouldn't there have been a new star at that time, just like in 1604, which showed the Magi the way to Bethlehem? After all, Kepler assumed that the new star was caused by the conjunction. But even without Kepler's mistaken belief that a planetary conjunction could produce a new star, for some researchers, this triple conjunction of the planets Jupiter and Saturn is itself the most interesting candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. Conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn are also called great conjunctions. The English scholar Roger Bacon, who lived in the 13th century, believed that all great religious movements were heralded by great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn. He believed that it could refer not only to Jesus, but also to Moses. Also, the birth of Muhammad in the year 571 is said to have been indicated by a great conjunction that occurred in the constellation of Scorpio. In 1925, the German Orientalist, Paul Schnabel, deciphered a more than 2,000-year-old Neo-Babylonian cuneiform tablet, on which the triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn from the year 7 BC is documented. This discovery could imply that the celestial event might have been known to the Magi before, so it would not have been a surprise to them at all. They might even have expected this planetary alignment. Later, the Austrian astronomer Conradin Ferrari d'Occhiapo found further cuneiform writings in the British Museum in London, which are to describe this astronomical event likewise. Thereupon he published several books, in which he advanced the theory, according to which the Star of Bethlehem was based on the Great Conjunction of 7 BC. A special aspect of a triple Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is its rarity. Other planetary conjunctions happen multiple times per decade, but Jupiter and Saturn only perform a celestial dance once every 2 decades. And the triple conjunction is even much rarer. Most recently, a simple encounter of Jupiter and Saturn occurred during the Christmas season of 2020 in the constellations Aquarius and Capricorn. This event received a lot of media attention, and it became known as the new Christmas star of 2020. Before that, the last great conjunction took place in 2000, and previous to that, in 1981. This period of about 20 years is related to the orbits of both planets around the Sun. Jupiter takes nearly 12 years to make a revolution around the Sun, while Saturn requires nearly 30 years for its orbit. However, if Jupiter and Saturn get close to the so-called opposition of their orbits, that is, when both planets form a connecting line with the Earth and the Sun, 3 close encounters can take place in less than 1 year. This is then called a triple conjunction. And this takes place only every 100 to 350 years. It's such a rarity that it has only occurred 20 times in the last 3,000 years. Every time it took place in a different zodiacal constellation. The last time a triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn occurred in 1981. The next one will not take place until 2238. That is in 216 years. An even greater rarity are triple conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn which take place in the same constellation of the zodiac. In Pisces, as in the year 7 BC, there have only been 2 in the last 3,000 years. Since then, it happened never again, and it will not occur again in the next millennium. The 3 individual close encounters of Jupiter and Saturn during the year 7 BC occurred several months apart and spanned about half a year. That was enough time for the Magi to observe them both, before they had set out from their homeland, and when they arrived in Bethlehem. The first encounter took place at the end of May, the second at the beginning of October, and the third and last one at the beginning of December. Each time the planets approached to a distance of about 1 degree. These 3 encounters were accompanied by strange movements of the planets in the sky. Both planets appeared to stand still at times, then move back, and then move on again in the previous direction. This effect of standing still, retrograde, and looping motion of planets was well known in antiquity, but for a long time there was no explanation for it. This effect does not only occur with Jupiter and Saturn, but also, as shown here, with the planet Mars. The planet appears to be moving backwards in the night sky for a few weeks, before resuming its previous track in the sky later. This phenomenon takes place only in the time around the opposition of the planet's orbit. In antiquity, astronomers developed a complicated theory of planetary motion, called the epicycle theory, to explain these effects. The geocentric model valid at that time, which assumed the Earth standing in the center of the planetary system, simply did not allow any other explanation. Not until Nicolaus Copernicus succeeded in explaining these movements correctly. He did this by taking the Earth out of the center of the planetary system and having the Earth orbit the Sun as well. By its faster orbit, the Earth overtakes the more distant planet when both form a connecting line with the Sun. The observed planet seems to stand still, and its direction of motion then appears to reverse, so that the planet apparently moves backwards for some time. Basically, it's just an illusion. Could this great triple conjunction of 7 BC have been the Star of Bethlehem? Many assume so. And undoubtedly Jupiter and Saturn together would have been conspicuous in the sky, but it would not have been an all-over shining celestial spectacle, which would have been noticed by everybody. This could explain why there are no other reports of the Star of Bethlehem. Also, they have never been so close to each other that they would have appeared as one bright star. Crucial for the theory of a planetary conjunction was not simply its observation, but also its astrological explanation. For Mesopotamian astrologers, as we have learned, planets weren't just celestial bodies. Everything that happened in the sky was linked to events on Earth. And the triple Saturn-Jupiter conjunction in the constellation of Pisces in 7 BC could have been of astrological interest. Several authors have made different speculations about what the priest astronomers might have interpreted into this conjunction. By the way, an interpretation of the constellation Pisces as a symbol of Christianity can be completely excluded. Because the fish was not used as a Christian symbol until the time of the first persecutions of Christians. At the time of Jesus' birth, there must have been another interpretation of the constellation Pisces. Some interpretations point out that the sign of Pisces is traditionally represented in the form of two fish, placed in opposite directions. In this, they are connected by a kind of ribbon or umbilical cord, so in some cultures the zodiacal sign Pisces probably was associated with childbirth. According to the theory of the astronomer Ferrari di Occhiapo, the conjunction could have been interpreted as follows. First, the planet Saturn. It is said to have been considered in Babylon as the heavenly body of Israel and Syria. The day of Saturn, preserved in the English term Saturday, is the day of the Jews, symbol of the Sabbath and the Jewish law. Jupiter was considered the star of the king, regent of the planets, bringer of salvation and peace, bringing about grace and blessings. The Magi asked Herod for his star, that is, the star of the new king. The meeting of the two planets could be understood astrologically as a king, Jupiter, being born to the Jews, Saturn. The born king is the incarnation of the supreme god represented by Jupiter. The conjunction took place in the western part of the constellation of Pisces. This is seen as a clue to the location. The western part of Pisces is said to symbolize the land of Amaru. This was the ancient name given to the westland along the Mediterranean at the time of the Babylonians and the Old Testament. At the same time, the fish represented birth. The conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in the sign of the westland had to signify a turning point in heaven, as well as on earth, based on the astrological interpretation. A new and important king was born in Palestine. However, the Magi did not come up with this interpretation spontaneously at all. Since this conjunction was in the sign of Pisces, the sign of the westland, perhaps the astrologers knew that something great must be coming. But to the same extent that they had already predicted and thus expected the triple conjunction, they may have known beforehand what it meant in astrological terms. The British archaeologist Henry Rawlinson, who was decisively involved in deciphering the cuneiform script, published several late Babylonian cuneiform tablets in 1881, on which sentences are written such as, "There shall arise a great king in the land of the west, and then justice and peace shall reign in all lands, and shall make all nations joyful." Yet, There is no definitive evidence that these verses really refer to the astrological interpretation of the Great Conjunction of 7 BC. Today's computer planetarium programs show in seconds, with just a few clicks, what Kepler still had to calculate with paper and pen. We use the free program, Stellarium, and as location, we have entered the Iranian city of Hamadan, the former Ecbatana, the capital of the Empire of the Medes. As we reported in our previous video, this is considered by some researchers as a possible hometown of the Magi, and thus, also as a probable starting point for their journey. Perhaps at the end of May in the year 7 BC, the priest astronomers watched the evening rise of Jupiter and Saturn from Ecbatana, above the eastern horizon. This was the first of the 3 conjunctions, and exactly the observation Matthew describes in chapter 2, verse 2. The 3 conjunctions took place several months apart, so there was enough time for the journey to Judea, including all the necessary preparations. The observation of the 2 planets in the darkening evening sky on October 6 showed the Magi the direction in which they had to move. For now, Jupiter and Saturn were above the southwestern horizon, with the almost full moon standing close below them in that night. Now it was finally autumn, the most suitable season for the long journey. The blistering hot summer months were over. Probably, at the beginning of October, the wise men set out for Jerusalem. 8 weeks have passed. At the beginning of December, the Magi have arrived in Jerusalem. As described in verse 9, after their stay with Herod, they again followed the star, which is only now described as a wayfaring wandering star. It travels ahead of them as far as Bethlehem and stops there. Some authors assume in the standstill of the star, described by Matthew, a reference to the looping motion of the planets. But perhaps there is a much simpler explanation. The 2 planets stood high up in the sky in a southerly direction, as seen from Jerusalem, in the early evening hours of December 4th, showing the Magi exactly the direction in which Bethlehem lies. The wise men were moving exactly south, towards Bethlehem and the 2 planets, and these seemed to move in front of them. Everyone knows this effect. If we move and look at the star seems to follow our movement. But the moment we stop, the star also appears to stop. This is, again, just an illusion. Possibly there was also an apparition which, although not mentioned by Matthew, is often depicted in Christmas pictures as a cone of light, which is said to have shown the wise men the way to Bethlehem. Again, these images bear a strong resemblance to an existing celestial apparition. It could have been the so-called zodiacal light, a phenomenon that has nothing to do with the planetary conjunction itself. This is a very faint light, much fainter than the band of the Milky Way, very rarely seen today, far away from artificial light sources, for example in the deserts. It is sunlight scattered by planetary dust in the plane of our solar system and appears to fall to Earth in a cone shape along the plane of the ecliptic. The zodiacal light also occasionally frames the planets in the sky, which also move in the plane of the zodiac. And this is what it might have looked like. A delicate cone of light with the 2 bright planets at the top. The beam of light seemed to point from the heavenly bodies directly to the earth. This sight could have presented itself to the wise men in the deep dark starry desert nights. A beautiful theory for which there are some arguments. Therefore, many astronomical observatories and planetaria like to show this scenario at Christmas time as a possible explanation for the Star of Bethlehem. In favor of this theory is, for example, the fact that the star could not have been as conspicuous and outshining as it is commonly portrayed today. After all, it went largely unnoticed. The triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn would have been noticed by most people only at second glance. but it would very well have been noticed by experienced astrologers. This would explain why no one, except the wise men from the east, saw this star and why even Herod and his high priests were surprised when they heard about it. Furthermore, as already mentioned, this triple conjunction was visible in the sky for a period of several months. Thus, it is the only one that fits the descriptions in the Gospel of Matthew, because it was visible at the departure as well as at the arrival of the Magi. And finally, this explanation is currently the most popular because it also fits chronologically with the common assumption that King Herod the Great died in 4 BC. However, researchers have also raised justified objections to this theory. For example, they argue against the fact that we are dealing with two planets that at no time were so close to each other that they seem to shine like only one single bright star. They were never closer than about 1 degree, which is twice the diameter of the full moon in the sky. But the original Greek text of the Gospel of Matthew speaks of only one star and not two or more. Nor does it mention anything about constellations or conjunctions, but only of a single star. There is also no mention of planets, and in antiquity a clear distinction was made between the term star and planet. According to today's understanding, however, it is rather unlikely that the author of the Gospel had sufficient astronomical knowledge to consider the linguistic difference. However, it could be pointed out that by the single star mentioned in chapter 2, Matthew is referring only to Jupiter, which was considered the star of the king. Thus, Jupiter was the more important of the two planets. Some authors assume that by the Greek expression, en te Anatole, in chapter 2 verse 2, not the evening rising of Jupiter was meant, but its so-called heliacal rising. A heliacal rising occurs on the day when a planet or star becomes visible again for the first time at dawn, just before the sunrise. In ancient Egypt, the heliacal rising of the star Sirius was of special importance, because the reappearance of this bright star at dawn coincided with the annual flooding of the Nile River, the lifeline of Egypt. Heliacal risings, however, occur regularly and repeatedly. Therefore, it seems unlikely that this relatively common event had such a great significance for the Magi that they would have left for Bethlehem because of it. And if so, why this year of all years, and not the previous or following one? Moreover, the entire astrological interpretation of the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction is in question. Today, at least 4 cuneiform tablets are known, on which the positions of Saturn and Jupiter and also the conjunction in 7 BC were predicted. In these chronicles, however, this event obviously has no significance. The conjunction is simply listed, but without any interpretation or emphasis. It is therefore questionable whether the Babylonians attached any importance to it at all. This also concerns the interpretation of the constellation Pisces, according to which it symbolizes birth. This interpretation does not originate from the Babylonians or Medes, but from the Greeks. In early Babylonian star charts, one part of Pisces was called the Great Swallow. And it had nothing to do with childbirth. Many historians also disagree as to whether the planet Saturn, and also the constellation of Pisces or the Babylonian description of the Westland, ever referred to Palestine or Judea. According to them, Saturn was never associated with Judea, but only with Syria. Also, the Westland, Amurru, as the kingdom north of Canaan was called around 1200 BC, rather included the territories of today's Lebanon and Syria, and not Judea. Further evidence against these interpretations could be ancient coins like these, minted between 5 and 11 AD in the Syrian city of Antioch. They show a ram turning around to look at a star. It represents the constellation Aries, which was used by the city as a sign of protection. Antioch was part of the Roman Empire at that time, and this zodiac sign was not used in the city until Rome had annexed Judea as well. It is therefore possible that Judea was also under the sign of Aries, and not Pisces. The star engraved on the coins is the king planet Jupiter, which had a conjunction with the Sun, as well as with Saturn, Mars, Venus, and Mercury in the zodiacal signs Aries and Pisces in the year 6 BC. This rare meeting of 6 celestial bodies was also discussed as a possible candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. Michael Molnar, an American physicist at Rutgers University in New Jersey, developed this most recent hypothesis. According to him, the ancient astrologers interpreted this conjunction as a horoscope. The role of Jupiter as king of the planets was clear. If Saturn joins, noble and good people are born. Mars stood as a sign for a strong and argumentative person, Mercury for a pious and philosophical one. If Venus, as a sign for those who love God, is joined by the Sun and the Moon, those who are conceived will be kings. Besides this, other planetary conjunctions that took place in the years around the birth of Christ have also been discussed as possible candidates for the Star of Bethlehem. Probably the most exciting one is an extremely close conjunction of Venus and Jupiter that took place in 2 BC in the constellation Leo. This conjunction was visible throughout the Middle East. A very similar conjunction occurred in summer of 2015, also in the constellation Leo. However, Jupiter and Venus were by far not as close. In 2 BC, Venus passed Jupiter at a distance of only 2 arc-minutes. 1 arc-minute is the 60th part of an angular degree. The closest approach of Jupiter and Saturn during the Great Conjunction in 7 BC was about 1 degree, that is 60 arc-minutes. The human eye has a resolution of about 1 arc-minute, so at the time of the closest approach, the 2 planets merged into one single point to the naked eye. Several approaches, also caused by looping movements of the planets, could be followed for weeks in the nightly western sky. Therefore, it was well suited as a signpost from Babylon or Persia. Venus and Jupiter are the brightest planets. Nothing in the sky is brighter apart from the Sun and the Moon. This planetary union must have been an extremely impressive celestial spectacle. In the course of time, the 2 planets completed several opposition loops near the star Regulus, the brightest star in Leo, whose Latin name means the Little King. The Babylonians called him Sharu, which means the king. Moreover, Leo, the lion, was the symbol of the tribe of Judah, the tribe of King David. Jupiter, as we have learned, was also associated with kingship, and Venus with fertility, and thus, also with childbirth. All of this could also be interpreted astrologically in a special and very symbolic way. Well, as you could see, there are many theories about the Star of Bethlehem. But ultimately, none of them has been proven to date. So far, every attempt to explain the problem seems to have raised as many problems as it has solved. But whether the Christmas star was a supernova, a comet, a horoscope, or a planetary conjunction, and if so, which one, perhaps it doesn't matter at all. The Star of Bethlehem has always been, above all, a symbol, like other symbols are, each with a meaning that can be variously interpreted. In ancient times, for example, there was the idea that with every birth of a person, a star appears in the sky, that disappears again after that person dies. And the more important a person is, the brighter the star shines. It is also possible to imagine the reference to older biblical promises. A prophecy of the Moabite seer, Balaam, from the Old Testament is repeatedly mentioned in this context. I see him, but not now. I perceive him, but not near. A star will come from Jacob, and a scepter will arise from Israel. This prophecy has been interpreted in different ways. One theory is that it is a reference to the Messiah, who is hereby exalted as king. The other theory is that this prophecy refers to the kingship of David, whose sign, like that of Judaism, was a star. In any case, the term star, sun, or light were often paraphrases for kings in ancient times. Therefore, the appearance of the star reported in the Gospel of Matthew does not necessarily refer to a real astronomical event. Today, most historians consider the Star of Bethlehem to be a legend because the sources are uncertain. If one account has not been confirmed by another source, independent of the first, science will always view that single report with a doubtful eye. In the meantime, however, even most theologians are pleading for the Star of Bethlehem to be banished back into the world of myths and legends. Perhaps part of the fascination of the Star of Bethlehem is that its mystery can never be solved, because it is not all about describing a real celestial phenomenon. Maybe, from the beginning it was about creating a symbol that fits an event that can hardly be outdone in importance and significance. The birth of the Savior, Jesus. The star in the Christmas story symbolically points ahead to what Jesus will mean to Christians. Light in the darkness. Some decades later, another became the most important Christian symbol. The cross, which stands for the sacrifice that Jesus made for people and for the faith Christians have in God. And the star, which can be seen as a beacon of hope too, has also remained with us. Perhaps the star is telling us to be attentive, open-minded, and to look out into the world and the universe with open senses. Thank you all for listening and watching. We hope that you enjoyed our little documentary and that we were able to give you many new and interesting insights into the Christmas story. Even if we could not provide you with a definite answer to the question about the Star of Bethlehem. Nevertheless, we hope that you will now see the star not just as a decorative ornament for the Christmas season, but for what it really is. A shining part of our wonderful history, in which science and religion can finally be reconciled and complement each other. Please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. We also appreciate your comments. See you soon, goodbye everybody. And please always stay curious and eager to learn.